Okay, so we're on day 2 of the ceasefire, right, in Gaza. Things seem a little quieter now after 15 months of just brutal conflict. But when you see the level of destruction, it really makes you wonder what peace actually looks like. So today, we're going to do a deep dive into the aftermath. And I have to say, you sent over some really fascinating sources for this one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're talking about a place that's incredibly densely populated, you know, and it's just been scarred by this war, a war that, I mean, it's claimed tens of thousands of lives. It's hard to even imagine, the just massive scale of the destruction.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to grasp, really. One of the things that stuck out to me in the sources was they were talking about mountains of rubble. Like literally mountains, 50 million tons worth, which I had to look this up. It's like the equivalent of 20,000 statues of liberty all piled up. And get this, it's going to take like 21 years to clear all that debris.
Wow. And we can't forget the impact this has on, well, everything. I mean, the UN estimates that this conflict has actually set Gaza's development back by 69 years.
69 years.
Yeah. So think about that. Like all the progress they've made in things like education, healthcare, infrastructure, gone. Just wiped out. It's like they've been pushed back decades.
It's heartbreaking. And on top of all that, you have all these people who are still missing, buried under the rubble, thousands of them. It's just, how do you even begin to search for loved ones when you're surrounded by that level of destruction?
That's going to be incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
The Palestinian Civil Emergency Services, they're the ones leading the search. And their spokesperson, Mahmoud Bazel, he estimates that 10,000 people are still missing. 10,000. Can you imagine trying to, rebuild your life while you're also desperately searching for your family members?
Yeah.
In the ruins of what used to be your home.
It's unimaginable. We actually have a source here, a quote from a man named Mohammed Goma. He lost his brother and nephew in the fighting, and he describes this situation as, and these are his words, a war of extermination.
Wow.
It's such powerful language, and it really speaks to the scale of the loss and to this feeling that everything has just been completely wiped away.
Absolutely. It's just devastating. And to add to that, over 2,800 bodies that have been recovered, they're in a condition that makes it impossible to identify them. The emotional toll of this conflict is going to be felt for, generations to come.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom. And yet, even amidst all of this despair, there were these glimmers of hope, signs that life is starting to return to Gaza. Some of the sources talk about markets bustling again, prices dropping, and even imported chocolates reappearing on shelves.
It's interesting. Those little things, they almost feel like a small victory when you consider the immensity of the loss.
Yeah.
What I find fascinating is that it kind of shows the resilience of the human spirit, even in the most difficult circumstances, people find a way to adapt, to find hope. Life goes on, even amongst the ruins.
Yeah, that's a really powerful thought. But it also makes you wonder, how fragile is this peace, really? Some of the sources we've got here hint at, ongoing tensions and even sporadic violence.
Right. And that's a crucial point to remember. We're seeing reports of Israeli forces firing warning shots, and then there have been those settler attacks in the West Bank. It's a reminder that peace is a delicate thing.
It really is, and you can see these tensions reflected in some of the personal stories we've come across. For instance, there's Emily Damari. She was a hostage who was just released. She's been sharing her relief on Instagram about finally being reunited with her family.
And then you have someone like Nida Zaghabi. She's a Palestinian detainee who was just reunited with her children after being separated from them for 15 months. These individual stories, they give us a glimpse into the huge human cost of this conflict. And how complex the whole process of reconciliation is going to be.
Yeah, no question. So I guess the big question now is, where do we go from here? I mean, we have this ceasefire, which at least holds the promise of peace, but the situation on the ground feels incredibly complex and fragile.
Well, one thing's for sure. The road to recovery is going to be long and challenging. The sources make that very clear. You've got the debris that needs to be cleared, homes and lives that need to be rebuilt, the political landscape that needs to be navigated, and then there are the psychological scars of this war that need to be addressed. It's a daunting task.
For sure, and this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. We're talking about decades-long rebuilding efforts here, billions of dollars needed. It's a real reality check.
It really is. And money can only do so much, right? It can't erase the trauma. It can't rebuild trust. And speaking of which, there are these negotiations coming up in February. They're going to be critical. What happens there will have a huge impact on Gaza's future.
So you were saying these negotiations are coming up. What should we even be looking for? Like, what are the big issues that need to be addressed, and what kind of roadblocks might we see along the way?
Well, first and foremost, rebuilding. It's going to be huge. And I don't just mean like literally rebuilding the physical structures. I mean rebuilding lives, getting those basic necessities back online, things like water, electricity, making sure essential services are up and running again. But the sources we have, they all point to some massive challenges, like just the logistics of clearing the rubble, for example. And a lot of it is contaminated with asbestos, especially in the areas where those refugee camps were bombed. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of the money needed for all this reconstruction. We're talking billions of dollars.
And it's not just about the physical rebuilding, right? Like you were saying earlier.
Right, exactly. We have to consider the whole political landscape in Gaza, too. There are some deep divisions there, and those need to be addressed if there's any hope for lasting stability. Rebuilding trust, both within Gaza and between Gaza and Israel, that's absolutely paramount.
You know, that makes me think about the whole issue of hostages and prisoners. The ceasefire agreement included the release of 3 hostages and 90 Palestinian prisoners. But what about everyone else? The ones who are still being held?
Yeah, that's a really sensitive issue, and it's definitely going to be a central part of these negotiations. It's about finding that delicate balance, a way to address the concerns of both sides. It is interesting, though, some of the sources describe the recent hostage handover as this wild, self-aggrandizing display of force by Hamas. It's a move that definitely caused some concern in Israel.
So even now, with the ceasefire in place, there's still this sense of tension, like things are really volatile.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to dig deeper, to go beyond just the headlines. And really understand the nuances of what's going on. Because there are multiple perspectives here. And any solution, any real solution, has to take those perspectives into account.
One thing that did jump out at me in the sources was the amount of aid that's been flowing into Gaza since the ceasefire, like hundreds of trucks entering every day. That's got to be a good sign, right?
Yeah, it is encouraging. But even the aid situation isn't that straightforward. You have to ask, is it enough? Is it actually reaching the people who need it the most? And is there a risk of corruption? Aid being diverted. These are questions that need to be asked and, more importantly, addressed if we want to see real, meaningful progress.
It's like, even with the best intentions, there are always these complexities to navigate, especially in a situation like this.
Exactly. And that's precisely why this deep dive is so crucial. We need to grapple with those complexities if we want to make any sense of what's happening and understand what's really at stake here.
So as we kind of look ahead, what are the key things we should be paying attention to? Like, what are the signs that this ceasefire might actually hold?
Well, first and foremost, the level of violence. Has it actually gone down? And is it staying down? Are both sides really adhering to the terms of the truce? But beyond that, we also need to look at the humanitarian situation. Are people actually getting the aid they need? Are those essential services being restored?
And maybe most importantly, is there any actual movement toward a political solution? Will these negotiations actually produce anything?
I think that's the ultimate test. It's not enough to just, stop the fighting. We need to address the root causes of this conflict and create conditions for a lasting peace. A peace built on mutual respect, understanding, and, a genuine commitment to actually finding a way forward together.
It's a tall order, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And from what we've read, it doesn't sound like there are any easy answers. But I think it's important to hold on to hope, even in the face of all this devastation.
I agree. And that hope, it's fueled by the resilience of the people in Gaza, their determination to rebuild, to find a way forward.
And it's also fueled by the people working to provide aid, and those who are promoting dialogue, trying to build bridges. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are people who haven't given up on a better future.
That's what makes this whole deep dive so compelling. It's not just about understanding the conflict, it's about understanding the human stories, the ones at the heart of it all. It's about recognizing that even with these huge challenges, the human spirit endures. And that's a source of hope in itself.
So far, we've mostly talked about the immediate challenges, right? Like the humanitarian crisis, the rebuilding effort. But what about the long term? Like, what could the consequences of this conflict be for the whole region?
Oh, that's a really important question. Because this conflict, it does have implications that reach far beyond Gaza's borders. It could destabilize the entire region. It could fuel extremism and make existing tensions even worse. And the longer it goes on, the greater the risk of those consequences becoming reality.
And we've already seen how it's spilled over into the West Bank, right? With the settler attacks and the clashes with Israeli forces. It's a reminder that everything is interconnected, and what happens in Gaza can have ripple effects everywhere.
And then there's the impact on international relations, too. This conflict, it's strained alliances, it's fueled anti-Semitism, it's undermined efforts to promote peace in the whole Middle East. It's like this tangled web, and it's going to take a serious concerted effort from the international community to untangle it.
Okay, so where do we even go from here? What needs to happen to keep this conflict from flaring up again?
I think the most immediate need is a sustained commitment to this ceasefire. Both sides need to demonstrate a willingness to actually stick to the truce and engage in good faith negotiations. But it can't just be talk. There have to be concrete actions taken to address those underlying issues that are fueling this whole conflict.
Like what specifically?
Well, for starters, addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. That has to be a top priority. We need to make sure that aid is flowing freely, that people have access to food, clean water, medical care, shelter, and rebuilding that infrastructure, the homes, the schools, the hospitals.
But like we've been talking about, it's not just about rebuilding physical structures, right? It's about rebuilding trust, addressing those deeply rooted grievances that have been driving this conflict for so long.
You got it.
Ah.
And that's where the political process comes in. We need to see a real commitment to dialogue, to finding a solution that addresses the legitimate aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians. It's a long and difficult road, but it's the only path to a lasting peace.
And it's a path that requires a lot. Courage, compromise, and a willingness to see the humanity in those who we might see as the other.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond that cycle of violence and retribution. Recognizing that a future where both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security, it's not just a dream, it's a real possibility.
It's a possibility worth fighting for, even if it feels like the odds are stacked against it.
I couldn't agree more. And that's why this whole deep dive is so important. It's about understanding how complex this all is, confronting the challenges head-on, and ultimately renewing our commitment to finding a way forward, a way to break the cycle of violence and build a future of peace.
Wow, after looking at all this, what really strikes me is just how resilient the people in Gaza are. I mean, even with all this devastation around them, they're still finding ways to rebuild their lives. It's pretty inspiring, but the challenges they're facing are just enormous.
It is inspiring, yeah. And the sources really drive home the point about just how big this task is going to be. We're not just talking about rebuilding homes and infrastructure. It's about dealing with the psychological wounds that this conflict has left behind.
It makes you think, about what it really takes to build a lasting peace. It can't just be about, the absence of fighting.
You're absolutely right. For peace to really last, there has to be a foundation of trust and understanding. And those are both in pretty short supply after a conflict that's gone on for so long. That's why these upcoming negotiations are so important. They represent a chance, even if it's a fragile one, to start addressing those underlying issues that got us here in the first place.
Right. And the sources mention that those negotiations are happening in February. So in a situation this complex, what would a successful outcome even look like?
That's a great question. I think a successful outcome would need to show progress on several fronts. We need a real, concrete plan for getting aid to the people who need it, a commitment from all sides to address the root causes of the conflict, and maybe most importantly, a way for both sides to keep talking to each other, to keep that dialogue going.
It sounds like a pretty tall order, but I guess even small steps in the right direction could make a big difference, right?
Well, absolutely. And that's where I think, you, the listener, can actually play a part. Now that you've had this deep dive into the complexities of the situation in Gaza, think about what you can do to support a more peaceful future.
That could be anything from, supporting humanitarian organizations that are doing work on the ground to just having informed discussions with friends and family about the conflict.
Exactly. Stay informed. Amplify the voices of the people who are being affected. Advocate for peaceful solutions.
This deep dive has definitely been eye-opening for me. The sources you brought in have done a great job of showing us both the challenges and, those little glimmers of hope that exist in this really fragile period after the ceasefire.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I think the main takeaway here is that even with all the devastation, the human spirit finds a way to endure. There's always a chance for peace, but it takes all of us working together. We each have a role to play in creating a world where conflicts like this are a thing of the past.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the aftermath of the Gaza ceasefire. It's a complex situation, and there's a lot more to unpack. But hopefully this has given you a better understanding of what's at stake and maybe even inspired you to take action. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.